to get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pam Barron, Family Support Coordinator at Cotting School, and I want to welcome you to this Cotting conversation on puberty. In addition to this live discussion, we are live streaming this conversation on YouTube. Welcome to those of you who are viewing today. You can find a link to the handouts in the chat. To make sure that everyone has a chance to participate in this conversation, we'll be reserving the last 15 minutes of our time together for a Q&A, in person and through the chat. The full presentation, including questions in the chat, will be recorded and available on Cotting's YouTube channel. Today, we are here to talk about preparing for puberty. Not always so easy to prepare for. Unlike other transitions to adulthood, the onset of puberty does not have a date or an age attached to it, arriving on its own time schedule for each individual child. For children and adolescents growing up with disabilities, this process can be even more variable, sometimes with far-reaching effects. And like other transitions, anticipating puberty can stir up a mix of feelings for families raising children with disabilities. This discussion is an opportunity to prepare for the changes of puberty in a supporting learning community. You are not alone. Today, our panelists will be in it with you, ready to share a wealth of information and strategies to help parents begin to feel ready to navigate this developmental transition with their children. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to welcome any participants who have just logged in to our live stream. Don't hesitate to put your questions in the live stream chat so we can address them during the Q&A session. So, let's dive in. I'm pleased to introduce our expert panelists. Dr. Julia Berg is a pediatrician and fellow at Boston Children's Hospital, training to be a developmental pediatrician. And Rachel Vorkink is a school psychologist at Cotting School, providing counseling services and teaching health classes that cover the changes of puberty to our students. To start our conversation, let's turn first to Julia Berg. From a medical perspective, what happens in puberty anyway?
Yes, so that's a great question. Like you alluded to before, Pam, puberty is a developmental period when children undergo both physical and emotional changes in response to hormones produced through their ovaries. So that's, their ovaries and their testes, their gonads rather. And that's to attain an adult body capable of reproduction. So everything that goes along with that. As you mentioned as well, there is a broad range for the onset of puberty. And pubertal timing kind of outside of that range may be considered either early, also known as precocious, or delayed, right? Typically for those that have ovaries, puberty usually starts somewhere after the age of 8 to about the age of 12 to 13. And for those that have testes, usually after the age of 9 to about 13 to 14 is when you're going to see the first signs. Okay. On our next slide, we actually have some physical changes listed out too, of things you might look for. Oh, thank you, Rachel. I think we can go even one more.
Yeah.
So, starting with some of those physical changes I mentioned, certainly during this time, kids are going to go through a lot of vertical growth, okay? Breast development and testicle and penis growth, with breast development being one of the first signs in those with ovaries, and testicle growth one of the first signs in those with testes. Hair growth, okay, in many areas, as you can see there, and associated things like acne, vocal changes, menstruation, and unpredictable erections. These are all physical changes that you may see in this period. I'll go ahead and thank you. Switching gears now to talk about, social and emotional changes for those going through puberty. One of the things we know is that for many kids, the social focus tends to change a bit. So kind of shifting from the family more to the peers. And as a result, you may see an increased interest in social media use during this time, sort of a way to connect with peers. Kids also will become a lot more sensitive to the perceived judgment of others. This is a phenomenon we see quite a bit. They also may begin to explore their identity. So that can include many different types of identity as they're trying to find their sense of identity. This can include gender, gender expression, and sexual orientation as well. Okay. They also may begin to experience crushes for the first time, and they may seek intimate relationships with others. Some may engage as a result too in social, or rather solitary sexual activity like masturbation, and others partnered social or sexual activities rather. I also like to think about this time as a time when kids are really searching for independence, okay? So that's really important, and we want to support that, but they're also very influenced by strong emotions during this period, so keeping that in mind too, more so than adults would be, okay? So that's all for me.
So do we have any questions from anybody here about that piece of it, what happens during puberty? One of the things that came to mind for me is the sort of the increase in sensitivity to the opinions of others. With our students, where parents are always very sensitive to how their children are perceived socially, particularly around the fact that they have differences that may be visible to others. Right. So it's interesting to think about if that begins to feel more intense for a child. It may also be due to some of the changes of puberty, which is not to say that figuring out what's going on socially isn't an important and helpful thing. But I didn't really think about that aspect of it.
So that's an excellent comment. And I think another interesting part of that is it's not only sort of, what we would say actual judgment, but even just perceived judgment. So even more sensitive about even the thought that others might be sort of, and then comparing one another, themselves to others is something that happens certainly at a heightened degree in this period. Yes.
And for our students too, then. And also the interest, sort of more romantic interest, when you said, the purpose of puberty is for young people to gain adult bodies capable of reproduction. And my blood pressure went up, and maybe the blood pressure of others went up. I think that's one of the sort of emotional questions that come up for parents is, what are we going to do about that? Is my child prepared? Am I prepared? I don't feel prepared for this.
Right. I think that's a very natural feeling to have. Yes. I think, we'll touch on this a little later when we talk about advice and sort of tips for approaching these topics with your kids. But I think starting early, and often is really the key there. So we'll get to that.
Yes. All right, thank you. So now, so tell us a little bit about those tips. Let's get into that now. What do you share with parents about supporting their children through these changes and stages?
Absolutely. So, the physical changes or the lack thereof, remember this is a range, and so sort of people are going through this at different times, can draw unwanted attention, okay? Emotional changes can also be stressful and kind of challenging at this time. We know that, in this period, sort of that 10 to 12 to 13 age range, we observe that a lot of kids have a decrease in their self-esteem. And so actually around this time of life, they're at a higher risk for mood disorders. So like I mentioned before, letting your kids know sort of early and often that you're available to talk about these things. This should not be, these are normal changes, and this is not going to be a one-time conversation. This is going to be something you revisit quite a lot. So just having that availability and approachability to your kids and having that connection will be really important. I think too, I think we're going to touch on this later too, but using very clear language. I think in the curriculum that we do here, we can talk about this as science language. So clear language about what their body parts are and really their basic functions should be something that you're including in these conversations. And, consider using your own experience. You went through this as an experience too when you were younger. So kind of connecting with that and using that as a sort of a way to open the door to talking with your child that can be helpful for some families. I want to say too that introducing these things sort of early, both the changes, the physical changes, the emotional changes, and sort of the new routines that go along with them, even before they happen. So sort of giving kids a little bit of time to prepare and adjust to these changes that are going to be coming up. I've had some examples of families who will actually, for their children who have ovaries and who have, their periods, actually kind of starting with a pad in the underwear before the period even starts, sort of very early on. Okay, we're going to get used to this new sensation. We're going to try this for a few days, and this is why. So sort of using that as a way to introduce this topic and these changes way before, we're kind of in it and then we need to do something, right? That can be very helpful. I also think kind of thinking of these things, these changes, especially when you're connecting with your personal experience, as sort of like a way to empower your kids, as a way, empower them to embrace kind of their changing bodies as a way to sort of reaching their goals, right? If these are things that, having an adult body is part of their goals, right?
Yes.
And then lastly, do not hesitate to tap into your healthcare provider. We are trained in these things. We talk to kids all the time about these issues. We like to say there's no question off limits. And so if you guys are stuck on a topic or your child is stuck on a topic, please, reach out to your healthcare provider and see how they might be able to help.
Yes. I think that's a really important invitation because parents may or may not think of the healthcare provider as a resource before as opposed to during.
Right.
So I think that's a really nice piece of advice. Are there things that you do in your practice to try to encourage parents to start early? And if so, what are those?
Yes, that's a great question. One of the things I really like to do with my pediatric patients, back when I was a general pediatrician, was I would meet with them. So really kind of letting the child take the lead, as soon as they start to get around that age of about 7 or 8, kind of checking in with them first when they came into my office. So, and you can ask your pediatric provider or your healthcare provider to do the same, really letting them lead. What do you want to talk about today? What's on your mind? Let's talk about a few things. And then, some children might bring something up, some children may not. But then you have that space to kind of say, there are some things that, some of your peers might be going through right now that I wanted to just comment on to see if you had any thoughts about.
Yes.
And also one key thing is around this time, I love to meet with my patients individually. So kind of starting with them first and then kind of bringing mom and dad or, whomever their guardian is back, after giving them a little bit of a time alone. If that feels right for your family, that's something that can work pretty well too, to get the conversation started.
Right. Right. I think that's something that can feel challenging for parents raising children with disabilities because they have to be so involved in their children's health care. I hear a lot from parents that as children begin to get to about the age of 15 or 16, their pediatricians are asking to spend time. And I think one of the worries can be sometimes is, how am I going to provide some of the information that my child might not provide? And what are some of your thoughts about that?
I want to make sure I understand your question. So things, kind of a concern of what might the child provide that that maybe necessarily the guardian would not want to provide, or maybe not in that way?
No, more it's just that there's a lot of need to communicate complicated information, and there's only so much time with this.
That's a really good point.
And I think also, certainly at 7 or 8, not knowing what the child is going to say and how that might be interpreted.
Yeah, that's a great question. I always say, kind of start with, we're going to have everyone together in the room. So, we will have been doing that for, 5 years or so if you've been working with the same provider, right? And so, having that good relationship, this is something that, can be kind of talked about in advance. It could even be something that's communicated between visits, because I know visit time is very, very limited.
Right.
But, I think that's a great reason to have that good relationship with your provider, is to be able to say, I've been thinking about some of these things, how do you think we might bring this up in a future visit?
That's right.
I think too, now there's a lot more telehealth opportunities too.
Yes.
So some pediatric providers can even do, a consult with just the parent, let's say, to kind of introduce these issues. And I actually do that quite a bit in my practice. Is we have a, parent consultation. We kind of talk just like kids at school. We don't need to interrupt our routines too much.
That's
and we just kind of have a strategy meeting essentially about how we're going to approach this. But I think too, just not that example won't work for everybody. So I think having, if it works best for the family that both the child and the young adolescent and the guardian are in the room together, that's okay. We can go through these issues in the same way. I think using that concrete language and being very clear about sort of what our goals are of these conversations can be helpful.
Yeah. It's so helpful to elaborate on all the possibilities, right? Rather than thinking that there's just one, and also to encourage parents to connect with the pediatrician early. How do I start this conversation and get some support?
Right, absolutely. I mean, we're so connected these days. You get messages, you can send messages through the portal, phone calls, I think taking advantage of that in this sort of new era after a lot of the infrastructure changes to healthcare, it's one positive.
Right, yes, okay. Thanks. I want to just give a quick reminder to those who are live streaming to please put your questions in the chat because we want to be able to include you in the conversation as well. All right. So one of the things that parents may feel sometimes, parents and guardians, is that it feels more challenging somehow to approach puberty with their children with complex medical and developmental issues. And what are some of the things that do make this period a little more complicated?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think, these physical and these emotional changes can be even more challenging for those that are developing differently and their families. And I think for a few reasons. One of the first that comes to mind is, especially for those that have more difficulty with changing routines, we have physical changes, we have changing routines, and we have changing social demands, really. And so, for those that struggle with either engaging in social communication or with their routines kind of getting changed, it kind of feels like a double whammy, sort of both at once, right? So I think that's something we can't underestimate here. I think, too, some societal barriers or biases may also contribute and kind of get in the way and add some challenge here. I think, some individuals like this with developing differently may be erroneously viewed as either childlike or in need of protection, sort of avoid these topics, asexual or inappropriately sexual as well. So we have to keep that in mind because, lack of education about puberty and about sexual education, unfortunately, predisposes individuals in this population to even a higher risk of victimization and abuse. And we do know that the statistics are clear on this, that there is a higher risk, right? About 2.2%, or 2.2 times rather, higher than those of the typically developing population. And so really important to keep in mind that education is even more important for them. I think, some things we can foster, and I think these are some of the goals I work with my families, is really fostering that social communication. So things like greetings, eye contact, body language, and what those things may mean to others, even if it's sort of inadvertent, right? Self-advocacy skills, phone and computer use skills, and very importantly, personal space, which I know we'll talk about later too. Fostering these skills could be very helpful, I think, for individuals who are developing differently. I also think, those changing routines, kind of introducing those opportunities for self-care, so self-hygiene activities, things like this. Not only do they build skills, but they also kind of, as we talked about before, they sort of fill that need for that emotional independence, those opportunities for autonomy, and that can actually help build self-esteem and builds, as they're building skills, they're building their self-esteem. So I think those are all important ways to approach for this population.
Yeah, and I think those are all really important points. I think that parents raising children with disabilities are quite aware of those statistics, and the question of safety is one of those emotions. How will my child be safe? How can I help my child be safe? And that can be a barrier sometimes, an emotional barrier for being able to sort of take it in, especially, I was sort of struck, around 7 or 8, and, kids are teeny then, and it seems like it's way in the future, but I really like what you are sharing about the things that really are about general development, that are important contributors to be able to manage this transition. One is from the very start, calling body parts what they are, and that can start as soon as you're talking to your child.
I actually have a colleague in the field who was interviewed recently for NPR, and she said by developmental age of 3, they should know their names of their regular body, many of their body parts and their basic functions.
Yes, absolutely.
It's never too early to get started.
Right. So you can sort of disconnect that from puberty, but it's also preparing for being able to manage this. And also, the kinds of things that parents and schools are working on developmentally in terms of self-advocacy, communication, feeling able to talk about what's going on with their bodies. Those are all really important things too.
Right. I think too, sort of being able, when we talk about self-advocacy, sort of being able to decline unwanted sort of attention or sexual activity is very important as well.
Yes.
So we'll get into that.
Yes. Another wonderful function of the terrible twos.
Another thing to think about.
The positive reframing of the terrible twos. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks so much. So you began alluding to what young people can learn about that will help them. And with that, we're going to turn to Rachel Vorkink to learn about how schools can be a partner in this process. Rachel, how do you engage your students in learning about the changes of puberty in your health class curriculum and in counseling?
Yeah. So again, early and often is the number one thing. I teach a health class in middle school, but I also just think, just in terms of contextualizing change in our bodies and our emotions and development for students very early on. So sort of as an example, the human life cycle, I teach, start sort of at the beginning of a year of health class, like talking about the human life cycle and what stage we are all in the classroom, the adults included. And that we all go through all of these different stages, so that puberty and adolescence is part of the process, and it's not sort of like, bang, we're beginning to talk about change then, but really we've been changing since we were born, and even talking about before we were born, what two cells, sperm and egg, are made to make human beings. And even with young children, I'm talking about that as well, because it's so important. So how are you born, and how did you become, and then how are you moving through the stages? And so it's just one stage within many, as opposed to sort of this big change all at once. So that's one thing. And the students really get, in this unit that I do, I ask students to bring in pictures of themselves at the different stages, and then we talk about how we're developing, how our bodies are changing, how our emotions are changing, what new things we can do at each stage. So it really feels a lot less overwhelming in that context. Lots of visuals is what the key to life. And so, whether we're doing visuals of ourselves or visuals of just how we take care of our bodies at the different stages, and where we need help, when we need help, that's really important. So I think within the health unit, that's really what it looks like, is looking at the human life cycle. And we talk a lot about science, and so if we're talking about learning about our bodies and how our lungs work or how our legs work, this is also about how our reproductive system works. So we have different systems in our body. This happens to just be one of the systems. And I do acknowledge that sometimes this isn't a system we talk about as much in public. And so you might feel a little bit more embarrassed to talk about it, or might feel a little uncomfortable. Well, Ms. Workink is saying the word penis out in the middle of class. Yes, she is, because this is the part of the system. It's not said as much, but this is, again, science and how our bodies work. So really normalizing it is like the number one thing, and using lots of visuals to teach and to sort of discretely skills, so that we can really break it down and understand all the different parts, just in terms of function, as well as how to take care of ourselves and advocate for ourselves in different situations. So that's the sort of main way I think about it in terms of teaching it. I would say across populations, so particularly who our students are developing differently.
You're really emphasizing the importance of visuals as important tools to be able to kind of communicate and identify at the same time. For students. Are there other tools that you use in teaching?
Yeah, well, so social stories are, and visuals are embedded in them. So if you look at the slides here, some examples of visuals that can be turned into social stories and visual schedules. So being able to break down skills, if you're changing a pad, what are the various skills you have to go through, from everything from being able to identify, I need to go change it, what is that feeling, being able to open it, being able to put it on my underwear, all of those things, breaking that down very clearly, providing students with individualized social stories that, even creating a whole library of different social stories around different skills in terms of self-care and also sort of body function. Early and often, so not just when it happens, but beforehand. Just as we're doing with anything, if we're thinking about a child learning to walk, like what are the different steps in learning to walk? This is the same thing. So being able to normalize it through visuals, and having something that kids can reference. I have a lot of students who say, oh, thank you so much for social. I look at it every night before I go to bed. I review it, so then I remember some of the skills, and it becomes like they own it. And that's really helpful for students. So I use a lot of social stories, whether it be in the classroom, but also individualize them for families too. And a lot of parents call me and say, look, I have this particular skill I'm trying to work on. I'm really nervous about talking about this. Can you put something together that will help me just break down the language? These are big, complicated concepts. and have a lot of emotions attached to them.
Right.
So if we can help sort of take our own anxiety and bring it down by saying, like, how am I going to present this? Just sort of facts and, you know, and descriptions with clear visuals. It will really help us as adults to be able to talk to our children about more complicated issues.
Yes. I really like how you emphasize that there are gains as well as scary changes
Absolutely.
happening,
Yeah.
and that the process is very similar to the ways we teach our students in general.
Right.
First, begin to understand what you can do more independently and what you need help with,
Right.
and that's something that kind of goes across our student body. And so it kind of normalizes that as well. It's not just with this particularly, but we're figuring out what we can do independently.
Absolutely.
And what we need help with as well. Can you talk a little more about how you partner with parents and
Sure.
engage with parents in this process?
Yeah, sure. So I do spend a lot of time talking with parents individually when a lot of parents know sort of me as that I teach the health class and particularly the units on puberty, so they might call me up and say, like, this is coming up. I feel like this is something we've been talking about and I'm seeing some of those changes in my child. I'm feeling anxious about that, or maybe not. Maybe, like, I just want to have the resources available. So a lot of individual conversations for sure. And then in the context of health class, being able to say, we're starting this unit. We've been doing body systems all year. We just happen to be arriving at the unit on reproductive system. Here is some more resources for you. This is what some of the things that we're using, both in terms of the slides and visuals, as well as resources that you can access as a parent on your own as well. So, and a lot of those resources we're providing today as follow-up. So, and make sure I wanted to make sure to highlight that.
That's right. There are resources available both in person here and in the chat for you to refer to and use in your process of preparing for puberty. I know that you've spoken a little bit, Julie, you spoke about safety and the questions of safety, and I know that's part of what the teaching is about as well. So.
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can look. There we go. So the Circles curriculum is a curriculum that we use here at Cotting that really talks about social distance and the idea, not social distance in terms of COVID, but social distance in terms of physical safety. So the idea that we are the center of all of our circles, and as we sort of concretely move out of the circles, the people that we know become sort of more physically distanced from us, and we learn how to sort of talk and how to touch or not touch, and how to trust or not trust those people according to what circle they're in around us. So this is a curriculum that is both used sort of in the grade school, but also in adult programming for children and adults that are developing differently. So, you know, just the idea of thinking about I hug my mother or I hug my family member, but I'm not going to hug the mailman. That's like the prime example that we often use. But the complexity of it in terms of puberty, too, is being able to understand that this is my body and I will give consent. I need to feel comfortable with whatever sort of physical, even if it's somebody who's helping me. And we have many of our students are getting physical help all the time. And being able to say that is comfortable, that is uncomfortable, or I do stop, or I do not like that, no matter who it is that's working with them. So this curriculum is really helpful. There's a lot of videos that go along to sort of illustrate each of the relationships and each of the ways in which we talk, trust, and touch the people in our lives.
And this is kind of a language, I know, that we use here at Cotting, and we try to model it every day in terms of, you know, even though we feel very warmly towards our students, we don't hug them. We high five, or we fist bump, or we, during COVID, we wave. And that's something that I think can be helpful to parents in carrying that out in the community, because these are really abstract concepts. And culturally, in terms of the culture's view of people with disabilities, you had mentioned some people may see people with disabilities as younger and not as more adult. And also, I think people want to show their connection and warmth for the people who are developing differently. And so there may be a lot of hugging in the community too, and that can be kind of a difficult dilemma for parents in the community. So this language can sort of help with that.
Absolutely.
Are there any other things that we haven't covered that you think might be important for folks to know? I know we're eager to get to questions, but if there's anything you're thinking about before we do that.
Not offhand. I think I'm always curious what people are thinking.
Yes,
so I want to meet people.
Plenty of room for that. So let's open things up for discussion. We want to include everybody in this discussion, including our folks who are live streaming. So if you're here, feel free to raise your hand or shout out your questions. And if you're live streaming, get ready to type your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure to cover those as well. And while we're waiting for people to type their questions in, we can ask we got some questions coming. Excellent, wonderful, thank you.
All right. Would you want me to read
Yeah, go right ahead, sure.
So this is from Janet. So she said, what about mood changes and increase in behaviors? That's a really good question, Janet. And for those of you kind of just joining us, we had referenced before that one of the, what we know, what's been observed is that self-esteem can certainly dip in, decrease a bit for all children in the early period of puberty. And so, along with that, they are at increased risk for mood changes, or I would say mood disorders. So some of the things, I like to think of it as sort of the extremes. So, you may see, because children are going through emotional changes too, they're just very impacted by strong emotion. And so there's actually been some studies to go over that sometimes adolescents actually reading social cues of adults, but they're actually reading them incorrectly. Like they may think like, oh, that person's mad at me, but really they're not, you're just kind of going about your day. And so just realize there's a lot of complexity here. You might just be cooking in the kitchen and your child might say like, I can tell you're mad at me, and you might get into a bit of something that just takes you by surprise. And so some parents will kind of feel that as sort of mood swings. They're seeing these sort of increasing or mood swings where they're very happy one moment and then they can be kind of upset really quickly. And so I would say, just like we've said with these puberty topics, kind of preparing children for this is important. But if you're seeing sort of mood changes in your child, let them lead. Kind of approach them and say, I've observed this. I'm just curious. I'm here to talk about it. If you'd like to talk about it, I'm seeing this. That you seem upset some of these times, and encouraging them to ask you as opposed to kind of reacting, but just saying like, if you think I'm mad at you, let's have a conversation about it. I'm happy to discuss that. I think once you start seeing extremes of behavior, so you start seeing that your child is really down more often, most of the day, most of the days of the week, I would say, you start to see that their interest in things is withdrawing. So maybe they were very interested in soccer. Let's say they couldn't wait to go and play that with their friends, or they're very interested in school and they loved that. And you start to see that interest, that joy sort of wane, where they're not as interested in that. Social withdrawal. Remember, this is a time when really the interest in peers increases quite a bit. And so if you start to see your child sort of kind of pulling away from people who they were connected with, that would be very concerning to me. So these would all be signs that might be indicating there's a mood disorder occurring sort of on top of, or, in excess of the normal kind of emotional changes that we see. Teenagers might go from 0 to 10 pretty quickly, but these, they, once you talk about it with them a little bit, and then they're going to enjoy their activities, they're going to enjoy what they're doing the next day. So I would say if you see any behaviors like that, and of course, if you start to see or start to hear anything like self-harm, right, any sort of self-harm behaviors or anything that's sort of indicating decrease in their self-esteem that might be more than what would be expected, things like, I can't do it, I'm so bad at this, things like that start to escalate and be persistent, I would be concerned about that, and I would reach out to your pediatrician or healthcare provider about having more conversations to that effect. I think, of course, just whenever we're talking about these issues, of course, if you're concerned about your child's safety or you're concerned, that they're talking about self-harm and you don't know what to do, that would be an emergency situation and something that we'd reach out to, emergency providers for. Okay.
And in terms of sort of teaching psychoeducation for children, I think we talk a lot about mood swings in my classes, and I also am a psychologist, so in my sessions too, like this is part of going through adolescence, a part of going through puberty, and sort of normalizing that process to what's happening to me. I don't understand, why do I cry 1 minute and then I'm happy the next. Being able to normalize that with sort of a monitoring of when things get more intense. But at the same time as teaching skills, I think also empowering students to, is not just like this is happening and I don't know what to do and I don't have any control, but actually I can learn some new skills through the context of this. So what can I sort of create in terms of a toolbox or a strategies list as I get older and become more like aware of that, oh, I'm having a mood swing right now, or oh, I do feel more intense emotions. What kinds of strategies really help me move through that? So that I can be more regulated. So that emotional regulation strategies and skills is really important to teach alongside with the idea that this is a normal part of growing up.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering, sort of to add to that, I think there are some young people going through the changes of puberty who don't necessarily have the language to be able to describe what's going on, and it may be expressed more in kind of physical behaviors.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I can start with that. Yeah, just one of the things I will sometimes hear families talk about is just sort of a more irritability, a little bit more irritability. And that can be, kind of into the self-regulation piece. That they may feel like they don't quite have skills in that area yet. And I think you are the experts in your child. You guys have the best sense of when they're encountering new situations or in their day-to-day life, how they react to things. So if you start to see that they're becoming more irritable or you're seeing reactions that you wouldn't expect, that's absolutely a warning sign and should be taken very seriously by your healthcare provider and all of your providers, So certainly you might see that. I would say too, sleep is a very important part of this too. Teenagers need a lot of sleep. They still need, more sleep than we do, certainly as adults, but anywhere from about 9 to 10 hours is typically what we recommend. So, but if you start to see that your child is sleeping really more or even much less than typical, I think that's also a concerning sign when you start to think about mood disorders and how that might be playing into things in this period.
I would say also lots of practice for children maybe with more cognitive challenges around identifying emotions, being able to use a set of visuals, whether you have a device, a communication device, being able to make sure that your device is programmed with a variety of different emotions, even like talking about, adding some of that more vocabulary and picture content around puberty within the device, just giving more access to be able to talk about things and to model, even if they aren't accessing the device themselves, you're modeling a lot of that. So emotion identification as well as having a set in the device that has the tools. These are some of my tools. I have breathing, I listen to music, I ask for a break, being able to continually model and practice repetition and review those things, as we should be all along, but in particularly when we hit sort of more mood swings. I think it's important to have that available.
And for parents to have those those visuals and those strategies available as well. Makes sense.
Thank you, Janet. Great question.
Yeah.
I appreciate the whole discussion and just I know on your slides you have a lot of tools, so I'm very interested in utilizing those. My teen is mid-teens, and just the idea of very well into puberty, but just like the sexual exploration, and so the challenges of how do you let them have some autonomy, and it is an uncomfortable situation as a parent, and just how to support them in that exploration, but also keeping them safe, especially with the access to the internet these days, which is really challenging. So I guess just if you have sources already that can point to for that, or just suggestions, or even having more social stories, I think would be helpful for us as parents in that realm.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk a lot about public and private sort of actions and thoughts, and talk too. So being able to identify like where is it somewhere where I can be private and I can have some more body exploration that's sort of my own, and when is it that's not the right time because that's a more public space. So using that, and I actually have some great social stories on just like self-body exploration in general that I'd be happy to share those specifically. But I think, again, normalizing that this is part of growing up, that it's okay to be interested in our body, it's okay to get pleasure from our body, but figuring out when and where, and also being able to, I think there's too much on the internet, and so really thinking about how you want to, have some parent controls on the internet. I really can't stress that enough. I think there is just too much that's available that's not helpful and confusing. And our tech department at Cotting can be really helpful in giving some suggestions too about some of that piece. But that's a couple of things I can think about that would be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hear in part of your question sort of how to be supportive in terms of interactions with, we might call them sweethearts, a chosen other, where they're, the sort of have a romantic relationship. And I know from many of the parents here at Cotting, it's a family affair. And so that sort of sense of how do you stay involved in your child's sort of dating and more romantic social relationships, should they choose that, and still give some autonomy. And it means interacting with other families too, and that's a whole other layer. But I want to refer back a little bit to the Circles curriculum and what it can provide too in terms of what does it mean to have a romantic relationship, and how do you negotiate that, for lack of a better word? What are the steps that one takes? You don't just sort of decide, I'm in a romantic relationship with so-and-so. There's a process you have to go through first, and we're involved in that very much right now at Cotting, because our prom is this Friday, and so sort of the question of what does it mean to go to the prom with someone is very much on our minds. So wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
So in my classes and also in my work individually, I do a sort of a dating unit as well, and we talk about the different steps of sort of getting to know someone, and where we have to be introduced first, and we have to, we don't just sort of, I have a lot of students, oh, that's my boyfriend. Well, did you actually meet them? No, we haven't met. Oh, okay, well, we need to step back. So we need to be introduced, and we need to have things in common. We need to be closer in age, and we sort of go through different steps of like building trust and intimacy over time. And I'll like say, sometimes have to be very concrete. Like step one is we are literally introduced to the person. So, and we talk a lot about those safety around that too. And it has to feel comfortable for both people, and both people have to agree. And so I think that piece is really helpful for students, because there's just so much content out there and so many shows that we're watching.
Right.
It seems so seamless, right? It's not seamless, and it's so complicated, and there are all of those discrete social skills too that you were talking about, eye contact and the less clear sort of social cues that we're getting that we might not be able to read as easily. So we need to really explicitly teach things and have that sort of gamut of social stories that we can pull out and say, oh, this is my one that I'm going to sort of remind myself on some of those rules around dating and what's helpful. So
Right. That's right. And I think that also mirrors how so many of our students learn everything, which is understanding the steps. Sometimes it's very hard to understand, how do I get from here to there, but knowing the steps and having reminders of what those steps are and having supported those steps can make a big difference.
And then when the gray areas come up, which they will, because there are so many of them in relationships, we can refer back to the sort of foundational steps and say, okay, well, let's think, what step are we in here, and what could we do in this situation? We don't know that person well enough yet, because we haven't really reached this step yet. But we might need to navigate, because there will be conversations that I'm confused about this doesn't make sense, and we have to just continue to use those foundational things that we provide that will help kind of ground kids.
I think that step of needing to be introduced, which sounds Victorian but really helpful, because you're absolutely right. Everybody gets introduced or introduces themselves. And so that makes that step very concrete, and is very helpful for some of our students who develop crushes on public figures and really feel like this is my person, and may even meet these people in person and are treated very kindly, which is of course, what you hope for. And they have been introduced, but then you have the other steps to try to help them understand what kind of relationship this is.
And I just want to comment that I know it seems like there's a lot of steps here that we need to go through and learn, but I will say that, you know, when they've done studies of sort of international, across the world, you know, sexual, not just sexual, you know, when I think of an intimate relationship, it's not just sexual activities, right? It's knowledge, it's belief, it's sharing, it's trust, and that relationship and having an intimate relationship with another is considered, you know, something that many people in the world value, right? This is valued across, you know, all types of developmental levels, all across the world. And so it's certainly something that brings value to many people's lives, and so it's worth going through some of these steps and trying to
really
you know, provide that and to have it, because it is so important to so many.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Well, thank you both. I just want to, do we have any other questions in the chat? Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that all of you who are live streaming were able to join us today, and we're very grateful to those of you who came to participate in this conversation in person. And I want to thank both of our expert panelists very much for sharing your knowledge and experience with the folks here today.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for hosting.